January 22, 1943, 6:14. Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant John George lay prone on rotting palm fronds, smelling the mildew rising from the waterlogged soil as he adjusted the Lyman Alaskan scope mounted on his Winchester Model 70. Morning fog still hung between the shattered coconut palms, and somewhere beyond that curtain of vapor, a Japanese sniper waited. 14 Americans had died in 72 hours, all with a single shot to the head or chest, all killed by marksmen who were never seen. George could hear his own heart beating against the damp ground. His hands were steady on the civilian hunting rifle he'd bought mail order 2 years earlier, when he was still a simple National Guard soldier earning $17 a month. It had taken him 24 months to save enough to buy that Winchester, plus the Lyman hunting scope, plus 350.30-06 cartridges he'd been carrying on his back since landing on this cursed island. Captain Morris had mocked him 3 days ago, calling the rifle his mail-order sweetheart, and ordering George to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon like all the other officers. Lieutenants Johnson and Myers laughed when George explained that his Winchester could group 5 shots in a 2-inch circle at 100 yards, something no M1 Garand could ever do. "That's target shooting, George," Johnson said while cleaning his semi-automatic Garand. "Out here in the jungle you need firepower, not shooting club accuracy." George didn't argue. He simply returned to his tent, cleaned the Winchester for the 100th time, and waited. Because George knew something his fellow officers didn't. He'd grown up hunting deer in Pennsylvania's Allegheny Mountains, where a missed shot meant coming home empty-handed and facing his father's disappointed look. He'd learned to calculate distance by the apparent size of familiar objects, to read the wind by how leaves trembled, to control his breathing until his body became merely a support for the rifle. And now, lying on that rotten soil of Guadalcanal, he would finally have the chance to prove everyone wrong. The Japanese sniper made his first mistake at 6:23. George saw a tiny glint, no more than a point of reflected light, coming from a broken palm tree approximately 300 yards away. Most soldiers would have ignored it, mistaking it for dew or a metal fragment. But George had spent 1,000 hours studying that jungle through his scope, memorizing every fallen tree, every bush, every shadow that changed with the sun's movement. That glint shouldn't have been there. He adjusted the scope's elevation, compensating for 300 yards, and waited. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, not pressing, just touching the cold metal. He took 3 deep breaths, expelling the air slowly through his mouth, feeling his heart decelerate from 80 beats per minute to 65. Sergeant Kowalski, crouched 5 yards to his left behind a charred log, whispered, "You see something, Lieutenant?" George didn't respond. He couldn't. Because at that moment, the Japanese sniper made his second mistake. A palm frond moved against the wind, just an inch, but it was enough. George saw the partial silhouette of a steel helmet, then the outline of a shoulder. The man was tied to the palm trunk with ropes, a technique the Japanese had perfected during months of jungle warfare. He'd probably been there for hours, waiting for some careless American to expose himself. George calculated quickly. The wind was blowing from left to right at approximately 8 kilometers per hour. At 300 yards, that meant compensating about 6 inches to the left. The .30-06 bullet would drop approximately 12 inches below the point of aim at that distance. He adjusted, aligning the scope's reticle exactly where the shooter's neck would meet his left shoulder, then moved the aiming point 6 inches further left. He held his breath, squeezed the trigger gently, surprising himself with the shot. The Winchester recoiled against his shoulder with a solid, familiar push. The shot's report echoed among the coconut palms. And 300 yards away, the Japanese sniper fell from the palm tree like a rag doll, tumbling forward and hanging by the ropes that secured him to the trunk. George worked the Winchester's bolt, ejecting the empty cartridge and chambering a new one. The movement was automatic, as natural as breathing, the result of 10,000 repetitions at shooting ranges and Pennsylvania forests. Kowalski let out a low whistle. "Holy God, Lieutenant! You really nailed that son of a bitch." But George wasn't celebrating. Because he knew Japanese snipers rarely worked alone. They operated in pairs or trios, positioned so each could cover the others, creating crossfire kill zones that made it impossible to eliminate one without exposing yourself to the others. His eyes swept the tree line, searching for the dead shooter's partner. Nothing. Just shadows and filtered light. George kept the rifle aimed, waiting, counting the seconds. 30 seconds. 60. 90. And then he saw it. Not a glint this time, but a subtle, unnatural movement. A branch that swayed when there was no wind. Approximately 75 yards to the right of the first position, slightly closer, maybe 260 yards. George adjusted the scope, compensated for wind and bullet drop, and waited for the target to reveal itself completely. The second sniper was better hidden than the first. He'd buried himself in a pile of dry leaves at the base of a giant coconut palm, using broken branches and foliage to create an almost invisible hide. But almost invisible wasn't enough when you were being hunted by someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of detecting camouflaged white-tailed deer in autumn forests. George saw the outline of a Japanese Type 38 rifle, recognizing the distinctive silhouette of the bolt and stock. He also saw part of a face, just a piece of bronzed skin between the leaves. It was a difficult shot, much harder than the first. The target was partially obscured, and any miscalculation would mean alerting the shooter without killing him. But George didn't miss. Not at that distance. Not with that rifle. He aligned the reticle on the center of the mass he could see, held his breath, and fired. The second shot was as accurate as the first. The Japanese sniper didn't even have time to react before the .30-06 bullet pierced his skull. The next 4 days transformed John George from a lieutenant mocked for carrying a civilian rifle into a legend whispered in foxholes throughout Guadalcanal. But the transformation didn't happen because George was an exceptionally skilled marksman, although he certainly was. It happened because he understood something fundamental that the United States Army, with all its military doctrine and training manuals, had completely overlooked. Sniper warfare wasn't about firepower. It was about absolute precision in a single shot. And that changed everything. On the morning of January 23rd, after news of the 2 dead shooters spread through the battalion, Captain Morris appeared at George's position with an expression mixing embarrassment and curiosity. "Lieutenant George," he said, observing the Winchester Model 70 leaning against a palm trunk. "It seems I owe you an apology for that mail-order sweetheart business." George simply nodded. He was busy meticulously cleaning the rifle's barrel with flannel and oil, removing any powder residue that could affect accuracy in the next shots. Morris crouched beside him. The Japanese still have at least 8 snipers operating in the western sector. They killed 3 more of ours last night, including Sergeant Williams. Good men, George. Men with families. He paused, looking directly into George's eyes. "I need you to find them. All of them. And I need you to explain to me why the hell that civilian rifle works better than our Garand's." George finished cleaning the barrel before responding. "It's not that it works better for everything, sir. The Garand is superior for normal infantry combat. Semi-automatic, 8 rounds, reliable, perfect for suppressive fire. But for snipers..." He stroked the Winchester with an almost affectionate familiarity. "For snipers, you only get 1 chance. 1 shot. If you miss, the target disappears and you're probably dead. The Garand is accurate enough for combat at 100 yards, but at 200, 300 yards? The components aren't made for that level of precision. The Garand's bolt has more play, the trigger has more drag, the barrel isn't as thick. Small differences that don't matter in normal combat, but make all the difference when you're trying to hit a plate-sized area at 300 yards. Morris absorbed the information in silence. Then asked, "And the scope? Why don't our snipers use scopes?" George smiled for the first time in days. "Good question, sir. The official answer is that scopes are too delicate for combat, that they can be damaged by the rifle's recoil or jungle humidity. The real answer is that nobody in the Army seriously thought about how to kill other snipers until we got here and discovered the Japanese are very good at it." He pointed to the Lyman scope mounted on his Winchester. This scope cost me $45 in 1941. It's made for civilian hunters. But it gives me 4 times magnification and adjustable reticles for elevation and windage. With it, I can identify targets that are invisible to the naked eye. I can see details that make the difference between a branch swaying in the wind and a man trying to hide. Morris was silent for a long moment, looking west, where the coconut palms stretched until disappearing into the morning mist. Finally he said, "How many do you think you can get?" "All of them, sir," George replied without hesitation. "If you give me time and freedom to operate alone." In the next 72 hours, John George transformed into something the United States Army had never officially produced, a professional sniper hunter. He didn't stay in one position waiting for targets to appear. That's what ordinary soldiers did, and that's why they were killed. Instead, George studied the patterns. He noticed that Japanese snipers tended to shoot between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock, when morning fog provided cover but there was enough light to identify targets. He noticed they preferred positions between 200 and 350 yards from American lines, close enough for accurate shots but far enough to make counterattacks difficult. He noticed they avoided the most obvious trees, preferring slightly less convenient positions that offered better camouflage. And most importantly, George understood that Japanese snipers were disciplined but predictable. They followed patterns because patterns worked. Most American soldiers had no training to detect them, so simple tactics were sufficient. But George wasn't most American soldiers. On January 24th, George killed 3 snipers. The first was hiding in an abandoned machine gun nest, using the earthen bunker as cover while shooting through a narrow slit. George saw him not by movement, but by absence of movement. Everything in the jungle moved with the wind, but that slit in the bunker remained perfectly still. He waited 45 minutes until the shooter adjusted his position, revealing part of his head for just 3 seconds. It was enough time. The second was tied at the top of a palm tree, using a sophisticated technique where ropes kept him stable while he shot. It was an excellent position, offering clear view of American lines for 600 yards. But it had a weakness. The shooter had to move slightly to adjust his aim between different targets. George had been watching that specific tree for 2 hours when he saw the subtle movement. One shot, 290 yards, crosswind at 10 kilometers per hour. The body fell from the tree with a heavy thud that startled monkeys 100 yards away. The third sniper that day almost killed George. He was hidden inside a hollow palm trunk, something George had never seen before. The position was ingenious, completely protected from all sides, with only a small hole offering a line of sight. George only detected him because he saw a flash of light reflected on the Japanese rifle's metal when the sun changed angle. He fired instinctively, without time to adjust properly, and the bullet passed less than 2 inches from the shooter's head. The Japanese responded immediately, and his bullet tore with splinters from the log behind which George had thrown himself. It was the closest moment to death George experienced in the entire war. He remained motionless for 20 minutes, waiting, listening, calculating. The Japanese sniper had a superior position and knew where George was. Moving meant dying. But staying meant a stalemate that could last hours. George made a decision. Slowly, painfully slowly, he removed his helmet and placed it on a stick, raising it slightly above the log. The Japanese sniper took the bait. George heard the crack of the Type 38 and saw the helmet torn from the stick. In the same instant, he also saw the muzzle flash coming from the hollow trunk. He didn't need to think. His body reacted with muscle memory developed over years. He rose, aligned the Winchester, and fired in less than 2 seconds. The bullet entered through the hole in the hollow trunk and found its target. On January 25th, George added 4 shooters to his count. And it was on that day he discovered something crucial about the psychology of Japanese snipers. They were brave to the point of stupidity, refusing to retreat even when clearly outmatched. But they were also creatures of habit. One of the shooters George killed that day was in the same position another shooter had used 2 days before. George had marked that position on his improvised map, and spent the entire morning watching it until the new shooter settled in. It was one of the easiest shots he'd ever made. Another shooter made the mistake of using a Molotov cocktail against an American patrol, revealing his position with a burst of fire. Disciplined snipers never do that, George knew. A sniper's role isn't to participate in general combat, it's to kill high-value targets silently and disappear. But Japanese training apparently emphasized aggressive initiative over sniper discipline, and George exploited that mercilessly. He was already watching the area from where the Molotov was launched before the flames even went out. When the shooter changed position, George was waiting. The third shooter that day was different. Older, George estimated by the cautious way he moved. More experienced, too. He didn't use obvious positions, didn't follow patterns, changed locations frequently. For 6 hours, George stalked him through the ruins of Point Cruz like two predators circling each other. Finally, George realized he couldn't beat him with patience. So he decided to do something risky. He deliberately exposed himself, moving from cover to cover in a way that seemed careless but actually kept him always near solid protection. He was offering the Japanese sniper a difficult but possible shot, betting the man couldn't resist. It was a life-or-death wager. If the Japanese was too fast, George would die before identifying his position. But George knew probabilities. He knew that even an excellent sniper needed at least 2 seconds to identify a moving target, adjust aim, and fire. And 2 seconds were all George needed. The shot came from a pile of rusted drums at 220 yards. George threw himself behind a broken concrete wall the same instant he heard the report. The bullet passed where his head had been half a second before. But now George knew exactly where the shooter was. He waited 5 minutes, letting the Japanese think he'd missed but was still safe. Then George circled left, using ruins and vegetation to cover his movement, until he had a lateral angle on the drum pile. It took 20 minutes to make a movement that would normally take 2. When he finally had his view, he saw the Japanese sniper still watching the concrete wall, waiting for George to reappear. He was an older man indeed, maybe mid-40s, with scars on his face and steady hands on the rifle. A professional. George almost felt respect. Then he shot him between the eyes. The fourth and final sniper of January 25th was eliminated at dusk. George found him trying to return to Japanese lines under the cloak of approaching darkness. A shot at 340 yards, the longest George had ever attempted in combat. Light was failing, making vision through the scope difficult. Wind had changed direction and intensity. These were terrible conditions for precision shooting. George missed the first shot. He saw the bullet kick up dirt 3 inches left of target. He worked the Winchester's bolt, adjusted aim, better compensated for wind, and fired again. The second shot hit. On the morning of January 26th, John George woke before dawn with an unsettling realization. He'd killed 9 Japanese snipers in 3.5 days, but felt neither satisfaction nor regret. It was like hunting deer, he realized. You track, locate, shoot, and then look for the next target. The only difference was that these targets shot back. He cleaned the Winchester for the 1000th time, checking every screw on the scope mount, every inch of barrel, every component of the bolt. The rifle had fired 47 times since arriving at Guadalcanal, and each cleaning was a ritual George performed with almost religious devotion. Because he understood something fundamental: a shooter is only as good as his equipment, and neglected equipment kills its owner. Sergeant Kowalski appeared with fresh coffee at 5:30, along with news. Lieutenant, Captain Morris wants to see you at the command post at 7 o'clock. Something about a meeting with Battalion Command. George nodded while accepting the coffee. It was too cold and too bitter, but it was coffee and therefore good. You heard anything? Rumors, sir, Kowalski replied. They say you killed more snipers this week than the entire battalion killed last month. They say the colonel is interested in your rifle. They say other lieutenants are asking permission to bring weapons from home. George allowed himself a small smile. Rumors tend to exaggerate, Sergeant. Yes, sir. But sometimes they don't exaggerate enough. Kowalski hesitated, then continued. The men are calling you the ghost of Point Cruz, sir. Want to know if you'll teach your techniques. There are no secret techniques, Kowalski. Just patience, observation, and practice. Thousands of hours of practice. Yes, sir. But most lieutenants haven't spent thousands of hours practicing. George had no answer for that, so he simply drank his coffee and watched the sun rise over Guadalcanal's destroyed coconut palms. There was beauty there, he realized. Even on that cursed island, even surrounded by death and rot, there were moments of transcendent beauty when light filtered through fog and transformed the jungle into something almost sacred. For a moment, George allowed himself to forget there were men out there wanting to kill him. Just for a moment. The meeting at the command post was surreal. George expected to find Captain Morris and maybe Major Hendricks, battalion commander. Instead, he found Morris, Hendricks, Colonel Patterson from division command, and a thin civilian in khaki clothes who introduced himself as Gordon Watson, war correspondent for Life magazine. Lieutenant George, Colonel Patterson began without preamble, your actions over the past 4 days have drawn the attention of division command. 9 confirmed enemy sniper kills in 72 hours is a record not only for this island, but possibly for the entire Pacific theater of operations. George didn't know what to say, so he simply responded, just doing my job, sir. No, Lieutenant. You were doing something nobody else was doing, and doing it in a way that contradicts our established doctrines. Patterson pointed to the Winchester Model 70 George was carrying. That civilian weapon. Explain why it works better than our standard equipment. George repeated the explanation he'd given Morris days before, but this time elaborated more. He spoke about mechanical precision, about how sporting hunting rifles were built with tighter tolerances because civilian hunters demanded single-shot accuracy. He spoke about hunting scopes and how magnification transformed target detection. He spoke about hunting techniques and how tracking wild animals was surprisingly similar to tracking human snipers. Patterson listened in silence, making occasional notes. When George finished, the colonel looked at Major Hendricks and said, how many men have we lost to snipers since arriving at Guadalcanal? 38 confirmed, sir. Probably another 50 wounded we couldn't confirm as being caused by specific snipers. And how many enemy snipers have we neutralized in the same period? Before this week? 6 confirmed, sir. Patterson let the number hang in the air for a moment. Then said, Lieutenant George, I'm going to do something that's completely unorthodox and will probably irritate half of division command. I'm going to authorize you to continue operating as an independent sniper, with freedom to choose your own missions and positions. I'm also going to instruct Captain Morris to allow any soldier in his battalion who owns a personal hunting rifle to bring that weapon into active service, as long as you personally approve the weapon and shooter. He paused. And I'm going to ask you to train a selected group of soldiers in your techniques. We don't have time for extensive formal training, but you have 4 weeks before we move to the next operation. Use that time to create at least a dozen competent counter-snipers. George felt the weight of responsibility descend upon him. Sir, I've never trained anyone. I'm not an instructor. You are now, Patterson replied simply. Correspondent Watson here will document your methods for a story to be published in Life magazine. The Army will use that documentation to develop official counter-sniper doctrine. What you discovered here at Point Cruz, Lieutenant, will spread throughout the Pacific and possibly to Europe as well. Whether you like it or not, you've just become the most important expert on sniper warfare this Army possesses. The next 17 days were the strangest of George's life. During the day, he trained a rotating group of soldiers in precision shooting techniques. He taught them to read wind by observing leaves and grass. He taught them to estimate distances using the apparent size of known objects. He taught them to control breathing and heart rate. He taught them to see patterns in the jungle's apparent randomness. But mainly, he taught them patience. The difference between an ordinary shooter and an effective sniper, he explained repeatedly, is that the ordinary shooter wants to hit the target. The sniper wants to hit the target with a single shot, at the exact moment, when conditions are perfect. That means waiting. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. If you can't stay perfectly still for 3 hours watching the same tree line, you can't be a sniper. During the night and early morning, George continued hunting the remaining Japanese snipers. He added 2 more to his count, bringing the total to 11. But something had changed. The Japanese were learning. The shooters who remained were the best, the most cautious, the ones who'd survived by eliminating 9 of their colleagues. They didn't use obvious positions, didn't follow patterns, didn't make foolish mistakes. They were professionals fighting against another professional, and George could feel the tension escalating every time he went out to hunt. The 10th sniper George killed almost turned the tables on him. The man had studied George's techniques, learned his patterns, and set up an elaborate ambush using a dummy as bait. George saw what he thought was a sniper in an obviously inferior position at 200 yards. Something was wrong, his instincts screamed, but he couldn't identify what. He watched for 40 minutes before deciding to risk a shot. The instant his fingers squeezed the Winchester's trigger, he saw the dummy for what it really was, a Japanese helmet mounted on sticks and rags. And he also saw the muzzle flash coming from a completely different position, 80 degrees to his right, where the Real sniper had waited for George to reveal himself. The bullet passed so close to George's face he felt the air displacement. It was impossible for the Japanese shooter to have missed at that distance. The only explanation was that George had moved at the last microsecond, some deep instinct making him turn his head a fraction of an inch. He didn't think. Just reacted. Rolled left, put a tree trunk between himself and the shooter's position, and worked the Winchester's bolt while moving. He heard 2 more shots hitting the log behind him. The Japanese sniper was using a semi-automatic rifle, George realized. Probably a Type 4, one of the new automatic rifles Japan had begun producing. That gave him much higher rate of fire than George's manual bolt Winchester. But it also meant less accuracy, and in a sniper duel, accuracy beat rate of fire. George waited. 3 minutes. 5. 10. He knew the Japanese shooter was doing the same, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. It was a stalemate that could last hours. Then George did something he'd never done before. He started talking. "You're good," he said aloud, knowing the Japanese probably didn't understand English but would recognize the tone. "Better than the others. But you made a mistake." Silence. Then, surprisingly, a voice responded in broken English. "What mistake?" George smiled. The man had spoken, and by speaking, had revealed his exact position by sound. "You used 3 shots when 1 would have been enough. Now I know you're nervous." There was no response this time, but George didn't need one. He'd triangulated the position by voice and previous shots. The shooter was behind a pile of sandbags at approximately 150 yards, slightly elevated. A good position, but not perfect. There was a narrow angle from the right side where protection was insufficient. George began moving, so slowly it took 25 minutes to travel 30 yards. Each movement was calculated, each weight shift tested before being completed. He became part of the jungle, just another shadow among thousands. When he finally had the angle he needed, he saw the Japanese sniper perfectly positioned, watching the area where George had been with absolute intensity. He was a young man, George noted. Maybe 25, with a thin face and steady hands on the rifle. He'd set the perfect ambush, had almost killed George, and now was about to die because he'd spoken when he should have remained silent. George didn't hesitate. Couldn't afford to hesitate, not against a shooter of that caliber. He aligned the reticle on the center of the exposed mass and fired. The 11th and final sniper John George killed at Guadalcanal was eliminated on January 28, 4 days after the deadline Colonel Patterson had established. This one didn't die from a tactical error or lack of skill. He died because George was simply better, and in a sniper duel, simply better is the difference between living and dying. The shooter had chosen an impeccable position inside an abandoned Japanese bunker, with multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of view. George found him through pure persistence, methodically mapping every defensive structure within a 500-yard radius and eliminating possibilities one by one until only one position remained. It took 18 hours of continuous observation, 18 hours without sleeping, without eating, almost without moving, until George saw the unmistakable glint of a scope reflecting sunlight for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The shot was taken at 280 yards, with crosswind at 12 kilometers per hour and diffuse afternoon light. George compensated, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. He saw through the scope the moment the bullet hit, saw the Japanese shooter's body fall backward. And then, for the first time in 6 days, John George felt something beyond mechanical concentration. He felt tired. Deep tiredness that went beyond physical fatigue. He'd killed 11 men in 96 hours. 11 human beings who woke up, breathed, thought, felt. 11 professionals doing their job just as he did his. And though each death had saved American lives, though each shot was justified by military necessity, George couldn't ignore the weight. He walked back to American lines in silence, ignoring the soldiers who greeted him and patted his back. He found his tent, lay down on his cot, and for the first time since arriving at Guadalcanal, John George cried. Not for long. Just a few minutes of silent tears in the dark, releasing accumulated tension from days living millimeters from death. Then he got up, washed his face, cleaned his rifle, and went back to work. The story of John George and his mail-order Winchester Model 70 didn't end at Guadalcanal. In fact, it was just beginning. In the following weeks, while George trained successive groups of soldiers in counter-sniper techniques, something extraordinary began happening throughout the Pacific theater of operations. Soldiers who owned personal hunting rifles began bringing them to the front, often against official regulations but with tacit approval from commanders who'd heard about George's successes. A corporal from Texas named James Murphy showed up with a Remington Model 721 in .270 Winchester and a Weaver scope he'd used for hunting white-tailed deer. A sergeant from Montana brought a customized Springfield 1903 his grandfather had used in World War I, now equipped with the Unertl competition scope. A lieutenant from Wyoming arrived with a custom Mauser rifle in .257 Roberts he'd built personally. Each of these men had grown up hunting, had spent years developing shooting skills the Army never formally taught. And now, for the first time, those skills were not just accepted but actively sought after. Captain Morris documented everything meticulously. He recorded which types of rifles worked best, which calibers offered the best balance between precision and stopping power, which scopes survived jungle conditions. He discovered that manual bolt rifles were universally more accurate than semi-automatics, that calibers between .270 and .30-06 offered flat enough trajectories for long-range shooting while maintaining adequate power, that fixed scopes of 4 or 6 magnification were more reliable than variable magnification models. But more important than technical details, Morris documented something fundamental about the psychology of sniper warfare. He noted that the most effective shooters weren't necessarily those who shot best at training ranges. They were those with infinite patience, those who could remain motionless for hours without losing concentration, those who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. An effective sniper, Morris wrote in his report to Division Command, is more like a wild animal hunter than a traditional infantry soldier. He thinks differently, operates differently, measures success differently. Forcing such men to conform to standard infantry doctrines is wasting their unique potential. The report reached General Douglas MacArthur's hands in March 1943, accompanied by Gordon Watson's Life magazine article showing photographs of George with his Winchester and detailed accounts of his techniques. MacArthur, who'd never been particularly interested in small unit tactical details, read the report 3 times. Then he convened a meeting with his chiefs of staff. "Gentlemen," he said, throwing the report on the table, "we've been letting our men die to Japanese snipers at a rate of 6 to 1. One lieutenant with a mail-order hunting rifle completely reversed that ratio. Why?" Nobody had a good answer. The operations colonel tried to explain that the Army hadn't anticipated the effectiveness of Japanese sniper tactics, that standard training didn't include specific countermeasures, that appropriate equipment wasn't available in sufficient quantities. MacArthur listened to it all in silence, then said simply, "Fix it. I don't care how, but I want an operational sniper program in every division under my command by June. Use this Lieutenant George's methods as a foundation. Requisition necessary rifles from civilian manufacturers if needed. And for God's sake, stop telling our men they can't use equipment that works better than what we officially issue. It was an extraordinary order coming from a commander who normally worried about grand strategy, not small unit tactics. But MacArthur had understood something fundamental. The Pacific War was being fought in dense jungles where visibility rarely exceeded 300 yards, where large-scale battles were rare but ambushes and small unit firefights were constant. In that environment, individual highly trained shooters were worth more than entire platoons of standard infantry. Implementation of MacArthur's order was chaotic. The Army had no official doctrine for snipers, no established training programs, didn't even have a clear definition of what constituted an acceptable sniper rifle. Supply officers panicked when confronted with requisitions for civilian hunting rifles, something that didn't exist in standard equipment manuals. Range instructors protested they were being asked to teach techniques they themselves hadn't mastered. But slowly, improvisationally, the program began to take shape. John George was promoted to captain and transferred to a training position, traveling base to base teaching his techniques to selected groups of soldiers. He developed a 2-week course covering everything from basic rifle maintenance to advanced camouflage and counter-surveillance techniques. The course was brutally difficult. George required students to remain motionless in shooting position for 3 straight hours. Required them to identify camouflaged targets at distances up to 400 yards. Required them to hit plate-sized targets at 300 yards consistently, not occasionally. More than 60% of candidates failed. But those who passed became some of the most effective soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Corporal Murphy from Texas, the man with the Remington in .270, was credited with 18 confirmed sniper kills in 6 months. The Montana sergeant eliminated a Japanese machine gun nest by killing all 3 operators in rapid succession at 400 yards, allowing his company to advance without casualties. The Wyoming lieutenant developed a technique of using mirrors to observe enemy positions without exposing himself, an innovation that saved countless lives. Stories began to circulate. There was the shooter who killed a Japanese officer at 540 yards, the longest confirmed shot in the Pacific War up to that point. There was the pair of snipers who held an entire Japanese battalion for 6 hours, killing every officer who tried to organize an attack. There was the lone shooter who survived behind Japanese lines for 9 days, subsisting on emergency rations and rainwater while eliminating 17 enemy soldiers. But for every spectacular story, there were hundreds of less dramatic but equally important interventions. Snipers preventing nighttime infiltrations. Snipers protecting outpost perimeters. Snipers providing cover for patrols. Snipers neutralizing enemy shooters before they could kill American soldiers. Major Hendricks, promoted to colonel and put in charge of coordinating sniper operations throughout the South Pacific area, estimated in a July 1943 report that programs inspired by George had resulted in approximately 2,000 American lives saved in 4 months. It's impossible to quantify precisely, he wrote, but before and after casualty analyses show a 43% reduction in deaths caused by enemy snipers. Extrapolating across all divisions where programs were implemented, this represents between 1,800 and 2,300 lives saved. He added a personal note at the end of the report. Lieutenant George, now Captain George, often comments that he simply did what any competent hunter would do. This modesty obscures the fact that he saw connections nobody else saw, applied civilian principles to military problems in a way that contradicted decades of established doctrine, and persisted even when superiors mocked his methods. Innovation in war rarely comes from official manuals. More often it comes from individual soldiers willing to question assumptions and experiment. The Pacific War would continue for 2 more years after the events at Guadalcanal. George would remain in the Army, eventually reaching the rank of major before being wounded at Okinawa in 1945. He would survive the war, return to Pennsylvania, and live a quiet life working as a civil engineer. He rarely spoke about his days as a sniper, and when asked about the 11 confirmed kills in 4 days, would simply say, "I did what needed to be done." But the legacy of what John George began at Point Cruz would extend far beyond his personal life. The principles he discovered, the techniques he developed, the validation that precision rifles and quality optics were essential for modern countersnipers, all of this would become official United States Army doctrine. When the Korean War began in 1950, the Army already had established sniper programs based directly on George's work. When Vietnam came, American shooters carried specially selected M14 rifles and later M21s with red field scopes, direct descendants of the civilian hunting rifles George had championed. And in modern wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when U.S. Army snipers position themselves on Fallujah rooftops or Hindu Kush mountains, when they use manual bolt rifles like the M24 or M2010 instead of semi-automatic weapons, when they spend hours studying patterns and waiting for the perfect moment, they're following principles established by a lieutenant with a mail-order rifle on a jungle island 70 years before. There's a small plaque at the U.S. Army Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, showing a faded photograph of John George in 1943, holding his Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope. The plaque simply says, Captain John George, 132nd Infantry Regiment. Pioneer of modern U.S. Army sniper doctrine. Guadalcanal, 1943. But it doesn't mention the 11 men he killed in 4 days. It doesn't mention the Winchester bought with 2 years of a soldier's salary. It doesn't mention how officers mocked his toy until he proved everyone wrong. And it doesn't mention the most important lesson George taught, that sometimes the best solutions to military problems don't come from generals or engineers or planning committees, but from individual soldiers willing to think differently and act accordingly. Because in the end, it wasn't the M1 Garand rifles or Thompson submachine guns or heavy artillery that solved the Japanese sniper problem at Guadalcanal. It was one man with a hunting rifle, a mail-order scope, and the courage to trust his own judgment when everyone around him said he was wrong. That's the true story of how they mocked his mail-order rifle, until he killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days and changed the war forever.